Hey everybody, welcome to Political Science 101. The first thing I want you to sort of look at is this particular presentation where I kind of describe political science, and I call it the mutt of academic disciplines. Little puppy over there is sort of a mixed breed, obviously. Often the nicest and most even-tempered dogs are mixed breeds because they get sometimes the worst of both, but sometimes the best of both. And I argue we get the best of all. And so, being a mutt discipline, we actually borrow from other disciplines in terms of their methods, their approaches, their research, and we integrate it into politics. Well, what makes us a discipline? The fact that we study all things political. Sometimes they're big picture things like our culture, which is very amorphous and fuzzy, the structures of government. But sometimes it's very, very micro level, looking at individual people or bunches of individual people, the way that influence occurs and what explains that, the processes that we have to go through, like an election or like the policy process, and then the substance of the policies themselves. No matter what it is we're studying the politics related to it. And so you'll see in this slide that we actually use a lot of philosophy, history, anthropology, sociology, economics, psychology, because all of those things help us understand politics. So there are a bunch of subjects in political science, and I put them there for you. I don't have to go through them. I'm going to go through a few of them in more detail in a minute. But we look at a bunch of different political subjects. In terms of the political science department here and elsewhere, in the United States there are four basic subfields, and the subfields sort of divide everybody who studies it into one of these four categories, and there's some overlap. For example, Professor Afenia, who's an American politics person, also teaches across nations as well. So the first one is political theory. Political theory is normative. We're going to talk about that in a minute. It looks at sort of the structures that should be in place for the ideal governance and the ideal representation of legitimate government. Second one is comparative politics. How do we understand sort of why or why do some countries structure their government one way versus another? So, for example, in the United States, why is it that we split the entire country into 435 districts, again, apportioned by state, and then elect the person who gets the most votes, whereas in Ireland you have something called the single transferable vote, where you go into a booth and you basically go, this is my first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, fifth choice, sixth choice, if you have that many. And then what happens is if your first choice doesn't win a majority, then automatically your second choice vote gets included, and they have to recount that again, the second wave, and then the third wave, until they actually go through all of it and figure out who won. Why do we have that difference? That's what comparative politics looks at. Third is a substantive examination of everything that within the United States. We call that American politics. And then finally, how does the United States or another particular state deal with other states? And that's international relations. So those are the four main subdisciplines in political science. The next thing I want to talk about are approaches that we take to studying politics. The first, and that's the approach I tend to take, is examining it from the angle that we call political behavior. We look at how people act, why they act that way, what patterns of behavior can we detect from those actions if we look at them over time, and then how might this rigorous study of past political behavior help us to predict the future. I can tell you right now who's going to win, almost certainly, who's going to win the presidential election, which is going to take place in 11 months. How do I know that? Political behavior has done 60, 70 years of very rigorous, detailed research, so that I am pretty confident that there are 3 or 4 factors that are going to predict the outcome of this election, and they have very little to do, a little bit to do, but very little to do with the upcoming election. So the winner of the presidential election really is not the person who has the best campaign all the time. It's basically, based upon the past research we know that people tend to vote for the party that they affiliate with, even if they're not conscious of it, and that economic factors, in terms of economic growth, help predict the outcome of the election, not the actual campaigns themselves. You could probably ask them why we have campaigns. That's a great question. Maybe we'll get to it in the course. This comes from sociology and then later from social psychology. A lot of the work that we do is survey research. Increasingly, we use political experiments like psychology uses human experiments to try to figure out how, why some people go one way versus the other way. So, but again, people who study political behavior use methodology similar to these other two disciplines. The second approach is the structural functional, and that's focusing on the actual institutions, the actions of government, and the structures of government. And so those who take the structural or functional approach tend to focus on how our government is designed and structured. Why does it look that way? Why do we have the separation of powers and checks and balances as opposed to Great Britain, which has a parliamentary form where the prime minister is also a legislator? Can't do that in the United States. Why is that different? Well, that's what structural functional approaches try to explain. They tend to emphasize the institutions and the processes, and again, primarily it comes from sociology, and you could argue that it comes from some of the older, more original studies of law. The third approach is political phenomena, trying to explain what happened. So, for example, in about a month, we're going to have the Iowa caucuses, and trying to explain why candidate X, my prediction is Ted Cruz, is going to win the Iowa caucus. We seek to understand sort of what just happened and why that happened. A better example is trying to figure out why President Obama, from the time he was elected in 2008 until up through 2012, had one position on same-sex marriage. He felt that civil unions, where they don't have the same status, but that they're called a civil union, was good enough, and that same-sex marriage or marriage equality was not considered sort of necessary. He changed his mind, and so those of us who would study this try to, well, what happened? And to do that, we would probably look at interviews, speeches that he gave, correspondence he may have had, campaigns, sort of rallies and speeches, or maybe deliberations about court cases challenging same-sex marriage. We'd kind of say, all right, let's go deep, look at the documents, try to understand it. The context matters, and we're trying to figure out, all right, how do we go from stability, meaning he kept that position, to change, meaning he came up with a new one. This methodology comes from history and anthropology. History probably before anthropology, but again, there are political anthropologists and there are political historians. We call them American political development or political development, depending if they're not in the U.S. The fourth is philosophical. Philosophical approach to study politics kind of is a lot like the philosophy that you're getting elsewhere in your education. It tends to be normative, focused on values. It tends to be general, meaning what is the ideal for everybody, all else being equal. It's deductive. It takes sort of a premise and then it lays out the premise and then tries to sort of construct from the idea how it should be arranged and then what will eventually need to change in order for the best ideal system to occur. This comes from philosophy and theology, and again, political theory or political philosophy is what it is. The next slide, not next week, is going to be, next presentation, is going to be on political philosophy. The next thing we need to deal with is political science distinction between normative and empirical. And this is probably the most important distinction between the study of politics and the practice of politics. Those who practice politics are trying to implement some kind of value system. And that's a normative approach. There are arguments about what the ideal policy is, or what the ideal role of government is, or how we have to change taxes, or how we have to deal with terrorism. Those are all sort of practical questions and the positions people take are based upon normative ideas, which again we'll see in the next slide. Political scientists tend to be, almost all of us, are empirical. We look at evidence. We actually look at what's going on in the world, but we tend to want to describe and explain and then later predict. And so the rigorous examination of politics that political science does is it tends to be empirical, and that means it's more basic research, not applied research. Applied research would be doing a public opinion poll to see how, a series of campaign ads might move some voters in Iowa or New Hampshire or in general. Those of us who study political science may have a passion for that stuff, but our job is to detach our own values as best we can and try to look at this objectively. And that's what makes political science different. Great example, I have a brother who's deeply involved in politics, and I often have disagreements with him. I'll tell him a year and a half ahead of time who's going to win the presidential election. He goes, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." And then when it happens, he goes, "All right, you know what you're talking about." Well, the reason he doesn't think I know what I'm talking about is he thinks that the day-to-day politics matters. But as a political scientist, I know that actually campaigns don't matter unless something really weird happens or abnormal happens. So that's the difference between normative and empirical. Normative politics really is the stuff that people who are practicing politics do, and then political philosophers do. Empirical is what the rest of us do. We try to really do some basic research on the knowledge of what it is that explains political phenomena. So now we're going to move on to key concepts in political science. The first one is the idea of power. Now, power and influence are essentially interchangeable. And one of the primary questions we ask is, how does somebody exert power or influence? Well, there are four ways: force, persuasion, manipulation, exchange. The first and third are considered in a modern sense, in a liberal democracy sense like ours, as being not appropriate uses, whereas the second and fourth are considered to be the ideal forms. And let me explain why. Force and manipulation assume essentially one person's trying to control another. The second and the fourth is one person's trying to convince another. So force, I'll beat you up and take your lunch money, or I will invade your country and decapitate all the men. That's clear. It's obvious that that's sort of making somebody do something against their will. Manipulation, the third one, is considered sort of to be the evil side of non-violent sort of power, because what it's doing is it's trying to get people to think that they're making a conscious decision, but they're not. Persuasion and exchange are considered legitimate forms in a liberal democracy, because persuasion means by force of my argument and the evidence I present, and I will convince somebody to do something. So campaign rhetoric, speeches, position taking, debates, these are all attempts at persuading, except in the case of the manipulative language we get from Donald Trump and others. Generally speaking, persuasion is considered to be a conscious effort to try to convince people to support your position in the hopes of prevailing. Exchange is much more tangible. It's a quid pro quo, as we call it. I give you something, you get something. You give me something, I'm sorry. So exchange is sort of often equated with compromise. I may want this whole loaf of bread, but you want that whole loaf. You want the whole loaf as well, so you get half yours, I get half mine. We're not completely happy, but we're happy enough. That's the idea of exchange. So force, persuasion, manipulation, exchange, four ways of exerting power or influence, which is the key concept. States is the second one. Now, a state is an organization that claims ultimate rulemaking authority and enforcement authority within their borders. So there's a geographic boundary, and there's legitimacy to run and sovereignty to control the decisions made within those borders that make something a state. Now, when we talk about a state in political science, we're talking about what a lot of people call countries. So the United States is one state, Canada is the next, and Mexico is the next, and Great Britain, Brazil, China, South Korea, etc. So again, states are jurisdictions that have some kind of status and legitimacy to control the people and the borders and the geography and write all the policies. Now, the level of control of a state varies. There's some that are unitary, which basically means the entire country is essentially run from the national level. And then there's the federal, like the United States, where you have what's called dual sovereignty, where there are national policies and laws, but then there are individual state policies and laws. And 90% of all the laws and 90% of all the bureaucrats and all that are on the state level or the local level. And then you have the confederal, where there's a very weak national government, and the states are semi-autonomous. Current Iraq is an example of that. The second aspect of states I want to talk about is that in this particular period in time, there seems to have been a decline in the importance, centrality, and of states, and the ability of the states to actually control their own destiny. Greece was forced to implement austerity measures by other European countries. That's an example of sort of the declining significance of state sovereignty. There are a number of challenges. That's an example of a sort of intergovernmental organization or a regional organization, which is the European Union, telling a particular state, Greece, that they have to cut their budget, they have to enter into austerity. There are other threats from states. The first is multinational corporations, MNC. A multinational corporation which cuts across boundaries can be a threat to a particular state. For example, in the United States, there are hundreds of billions of dollars being lost in income tax revenue because there's like this tiny little office somewhere in Ireland. Microsoft has this tiny little office, and all these other companies have these tiny little offices in Ireland so that they can claim that they're headquartered in Ireland so that they don't have to pay U.S. income tax on that. That's one example, but also oil drilling and fracking and the exploitation of natural resources. These are all examples of how multinational corporations or Walmart actually sort of are a challenge to government. NGOs are non-governmental organizations, things like the Doctors Without Borders or any other major sort of what we would call a nonprofit in the United States, where they seek to promote a particular cause. And that cause can, again, cross boundaries. I talked about intergovernmental organizations. That's a bunch of governments getting together, whether it's regionally or internationally, like the United Nations. And then, of course, there's the most recent one that's probably on your minds, and that is non-state actors, NSA. That included Al-Qaeda. About 10 years ago, Al-Qaeda was the major non-state actor that we were worried about. And now it's ISIS or ISIL or Daesh. They're all the same. We'll probably talk about that later, where they want to sort of implement a regional caliphate that crosses the boundaries of several current states in the Middle East. The third thing that we have to look at when we talk about states is this idea of sovereignty versus legitimacy. A state can have sovereignty, meaning we respect their borders, but they may not be a legitimate state. For example, Assad in Syria. We accept the boundaries of Syria still, meaning the rest of the world. However, we do not accept the legitimacy of Assad, the guy who has been sort of forcing millions to flee and killing hundreds of thousands of his own citizens. That's not seen as a legitimate thing, and that's why sovereignty and legitimacy vary. Next thing we have to look at are nations. Nations are different from states. Nations are sort of an identity. Group of people with a sense of unity based on important group attributes, whether they're sort of ethnic attributes, religious attributes, regional attributes, or consciousness. So, for example, in the United States, we had two nations for much of our history, the North or the South and everybody else, really. And so the Civil War brought us together, or by force, of course, brought the South back into the fold. And so now most Americans assume that we have this one national identity. But that's not necessarily the case elsewhere. For example, Canada. Canada has the sort of Canadian identity that is Anglo, from the British, and that's most of the country. But then Quebec, probably a very large and important part of Canada, has a French identity, and so French Canadians have a different national identity than Anglo Canadians. Two nations, one state. Some states don't have any national identity. Belgium really doesn't have one. They're trying to get one. And then sometimes there's a conflict between a national and a state identity, meaning that, the Kurds in the region that includes Iraq and Turkey and Iran, you know, that Kurdish national identity actually cuts across states. Kind of like, Texans think they're unique from the rest of us. It's kind of a joke, but it's also kind of true. So I hope that this introduction has given you some of the basics about what we do, how we do it, and the key concepts that I thought were important enough. I went a little over my 20-minute goal, and I apologize for that. I'll try to sort of be shorter. So when you're ready, you might want to go to the next presentation.